This year onwards from 2022, the placement outcomes for entering Year 7 New South Wales Selective High Schools will be released later than usual as the test was delayed because of COVID-19 outbreaks and the flood situations in New South Wales. And this will ultimately influence when these results will now come out. It is expected to come out in late July or early August this year if the test does proceed as scheduled on the 31st of March, which is just a few days away at the time of this recording. Although what has changed is the way these results and scores are going to be displayed to both students and parents. In this video, I go through what these changes are specifically, what results are typically displayed to parents and students in the past in previous years, and what significance these changes have for students doing the test this year and in the years beyond. Let's get into it. For starters, let's go through what the placement outcomes typically look like in previous years. And this will remain the same in terms of the process unless there is a sudden change that they haven't announced yet at the time of this recording. Depending on whether you get an offer at your school or if you're placed on a reserve list for one or more schools, or if you were unsuccessful in getting into any schools at all, this placement outcome will look slightly different. This will be the same as last year, where you will get an outcome telling you if you were successful or not. For example, the image is blurred to protect the student's private information, but clearly, as you can see, they did a really good job in making it into Baulkham Hills High School, which is one of the top high schools that you can even get into all across New South Wales. The outcome is offer, which means they were offered a position at the school, and as you can notice, their second and third choices, being Normanhurst Boys High School and Penrith High School, is not applicable. This means they were qualified for a position at a lower school choice, but since they were already offered a position in a higher school choice that they selected already, it is not given to them, and that is why it says not applicable. I don't think I need to provide an example or an image of someone who was on the reserve list or someone who was not successful at all, because that would be pretty straightforward and explanatory. But if you see the words reserve and a number, you'll know that you're reserve. Or if you see the word unsuccessful, then you know that you weren't successful at all in making it into that school. I will now go over the previous mark breakdowns or reporting of placement outcomes that students received last year. The image on the screen shows an example of a student who got into Parramatta High School in the selective stream with us, and this is the format of the marks in each of the 4 components of the exam: reading, mathematical reasoning, thinking skills, and writing. I wanted to provide a different student's marks compared to the one before, just to provide an overall mark that is a little bit more grounded and realistic compared to someone who just got into one of the top high schools like Baulkham Hills. Last year also included a school assessment score, which resulted in part of their placement score as well. If you attended a private school or Catholic school, this generally won't even matter because they won't even provide a school assessment score component anyway. This year, there is no school component score either because of COVID lockdowns last year, making it a bit more unfair for certain schools to compare and ultimately determine the rankings of students and their performance throughout the year. So they just took it out and increased the weighting on the actual exam instead. This was usually accompanied by a table which showed the student's overall score out of 120, the highest score that year by the best student, and the average score out of everyone who did the exam in that particular year. This was excellent to use as a reference point, and it benefited lots of parents, students, and teachers alike. I personally really like this information, as the overall placement score can be more easily used to see whether a student is going to make it into a school based on their entry score mark, especially if they were on the reserve list. Although just a few days ago, changes to the placement outcome reporting have been released. This was changed to align with modernized scoring methods. To be fair, this is the same approach which is done in other exams such as the HAST exam, used for students looking to move and transfer into another selective high school in years 8 to 11. What does this involve, you ask? I'll break it down. Instead of a mark breakdown out of 50 for each subject in the example that I showed earlier, you will see a diagram with the student's performance in relation to other students who did the exam in that year. There are 4 bands in terms of the reporting you will receive. They are the top 10% in that particular subject, the next 15% of candidates, the next 25% of candidates, and the lowest 50% of candidates. So they only tell you specifically where you stack up if you're in the top 50%, but if you're in the bottom 50%, they'll just put you in terms of a diagram or an arrow to indicate that. So if you are in the top 10% of candidates in the reading exam, in the New South Wales Selective Exam, you will get an arrow or some indicator to show and reflect that. So instead, I recreated what I think it will potentially look like. Remember that this is just a reference and should only be used as a guide. I have no idea how it is going to be looking like exactly. My initial thoughts are that this new change to the reporting structure will allow parents and students to better understand how their score out of 50 compares to other students. In the past, if you got a 40 out of 50 in terms of thinking skills, for instance, you may think you did a really good job. Although if everyone else averaged 41 out of 50 in the thinking skills component, just because maybe it was an easier test that year, you would not know that, as they only give you the average total mark across the 4 subjects. Instead, you will think that you did a really good job getting 40 out of 50, even though the average is 41 in that test. So you don't have a complete or accurate picture. So that 40 out of 50 would actually be below average, and therefore this new change will better tell you if you were weaker in a subject compared to other students or stronger in a subject compared to other students. But let's get into the drawbacks. The drawback of this new change is that there is no total score or any score that is going to be provided. This means that for future years, it will be harder to predict how well you'll perform in this exam and which school choices you should place in terms of entry score mark, as it will become less relevant or even non-existent. For instance, if a student wanted to get into a school, there would be a rough estimation or mark in each subject that they should generally be aiming for to maximize their chances and likelihood to get into that school. If they are not averaging a mark that's similar to that, then there's not much point in them putting it down as one of their choices. However, this will still play a factor, but I believe it will just be less accurate, as there won't be a specific number to work with. Instead, you just get an arrow in terms of the placement in that particular year. Because it's an arrow, it's just an approximation. I believe this becomes even more important for students and parents to work together with their tutors, as they will have a much larger sample size to compare the students' marks with to other students that are going to do the exam. Their initial feedback post-exam to get a better gauge on how well the student went is going to be really beneficial and important, plus their position in sample test will play an even bigger role. This year will not really be affected by this change too much, as you can still use the information and entry-level scores from the previous year. And you can expect that there won't be any significant changes in terms of what school choices that parents are putting down. Although in a few years we can see this becoming a bigger issue, because in terms of predicting any small changes, if there's small changes that are occurring every single year, then over time that will result in a large or bigger change, which will make it a little bit more difficult. This is exactly what we'll be doing and preparing for, but for students that are doing this exam, all they can really do is to try their best. They can't really influence the scores of other candidates, so they just need to focus on themselves. It's not like they can distract other students, because if they're making a lot of noise, they'll be sent out of the exam and they won't have the chance to do the test. So there's no point in distracting other students, especially in the same exam hall, because it will largely affect yourself. So the only thing that you can do is to do your best in it. In conclusion, the reporting of placement outcomes is going to be the same this year compared to last year. You will still know whether you make it in, or if you're a reserve, or if you're not successful. In terms of mark breakdowns, this will change, as you will not get a score out of 50 in every test, which is marked and scaled accordingly. Instead, this will just be a visual guide and an approximation of how the student performed relatively to the other applicants that year. This change will make it harder for parents to strategically put down which schools will make the most sense for their child to maximize their chances of getting in, because a score is not provided, from what the new change indicates anyway. Working closely with your tutor can help bridge that gap, but students that are doing the test in just a couple of days shouldn't really worry, because this change will be quite gradual for this year and really shouldn't change too much. But in the future years, this will play a bigger role, and I can see how sample tests will become even more important in terms of their ranking compared to other students. But that's everything. I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. If you had any questions or any tips that you wanted to share, feel free to write it down in the comments below. And after the exam, let me know how you guys found it. Do you guys find it easy? Do you guys find it hard? Share your experiences with everyone else, because after Thursday, fingers crossed, if it doesn't get delayed, then you don't have to do practice on study anymore for the selective. And I think that will be a huge sigh of relief. If you haven't liked this video yet, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more videos just like this, where I share and break down a lot of educational advice that I wish that I received and was available when I was younger.